So yeah, thanks so much for bringing me over here. I've been first time to Berlin, so excited to be here and check out the city. Just to give a little background on myself, just to provide a little bit more context, I started my first company when I was 18 in college. It was like a starving students painting company. And fortunately we were able to sell that for a very small amount of money, but that happened around 21. And then I started another company right after that, which was called Modernize. And what we did was we built a marketplace online to connect a homeowner with contractors that would compete for their business. Because I wasn't a very good painter, I figured maybe we could do something online. And fortunately we went through a lot of mistakes there. We were almost bankrupt 5 times. I went through 5 VPs of sales. I hired and fired 200 salespeople. I guess that's all to say that I've just made a lot of mistakes. And fortunately, on the other side of that, we were able to bootstrap the company without any outside investment to over $60 million a year without any outside investors. So I'm still on the board of that company, kind of a lot of blood, sweat, and tears in building that one. And then since then, I've been investing in early stage technology companies in Silicon Valley and through Upshift Capital and worked with about 35 companies, including Uber and Thumbtack and Metromile and Massdrop. So I guess that's all to say that I've seen a lot of patterns, both in falling on my face a lot and getting punched and slapped around as an entrepreneur, but then also working side by side with some of Silicon Valley's greatest companies. And so what I wanted to do today was to share some of the patterns that I've seen, both in the mistakes that I've made and also in mistakes that I've seen other founders make in the path of getting customers, because if you don't have customers, you don't have a business. So that's what I want to talk to you about today is kind of some of the lessons that I've learned along the way. For context, so how many people are actually working in a startup right now? I just want to make sure so let's say 40% or so of the people. So I think it's very important to understand, to have context around the stages that companies go through. It's kind of like a life cycle. Because oftentimes what you get is you get people giving advice and it's hard to understand where the advice fits. So sometimes somebody can give you a piece of advice that is based upon a company that is 3 years in front of where you are at, in which case it could be terrible advice for you. And so I think what I wanted to do first was just to set the kind of the context of the stage that companies go through, and then also what I'm going to be talking about today so you can kind of understand where it fits. So what I've seen is that companies go through these kind of 4 core phases. And sometimes they kind of make loops back through them. But in the beginning, typically you have this kind of incubation period, right? Some of you are thinking about starting a business right now. The way I describe it is kind of like shaping something out of clay. Like you have this idea, but you're not sure if anyone wants it. You don't really have a product, but you think people might want something like this. That's kind of an incubation period. Typically that lasts anywhere from 3 months to never. And sometimes it kind of loops back on itself. You realize it's an idea that's really bad. Customers don't want that, et cetera, et cetera. Assuming that you move past this incubation period, you move into validation. So this is typically when you're getting, if it's like a B2B business, you're getting your first 10 customers that are not your friends or family. It might, if it's a consumer business, you're kind of getting your first users. This is the early days. Oftentimes you have a website, but behind it, there's not really any full functionality. It's like a bunch of monkeys pulling levers, and that's really normal during that phase. And then there's this phase I refer to as the upshift phase, which is kind of post-validation, pre-scale. So it's how do you go from, let's say, 10 customers to 100 to 1,000 to 10,000. And this is the stage that I really fucked up. I hope it's okay if I swear on this, because this is a frustrating period for me. I went through this period 3 times where I confused early validation for being ready to scale. And so we just stepped on the gas and we burned $1 million over the course of 4 months and then almost went out of business and had to peel everything back. And so this is a really important phase of kind of knowing how to master the shift between these different stages, because what's right for a company that's scaling is very different from what's right for a company that's in the validation phase. And so I think this is something that I never heard people talk about before. I just heard people's advice. And oftentimes I didn't know if that advice actually was applicable to me based on where my company was at. So I think it's just important to kind of set the tone to say, so that you can all think about this framework as you're going through a business. You're like, oh, okay, we're exiting the incubation phase. We're now moving into validation, or we're exiting validation. We're starting to upshift, or we're exiting upshift and we're starting to scale. And you kind of do different things at those different times. You hire different people. You raise money in a different way when you're exiting these stages. So these are the 4 stages of kind of startup growth that I've seen. What I want to talk about is like the 7 most common mistakes that I've seen early stage technology companies make in transitioning from early validation and trying to go through the upshift phase. So just raise of hands when I say CAC and LTV, how many people know what that is first? Okay, so these are just some abbreviations, but I'll cover them just so everyone kind of understands. So CAC is the cost of acquiring a customer, right? Let's say it costs you $100 to acquire a customer. LTV is the lifetime value, what that customer is worth to you, right? So if it costs you $10 to get someone into your ice cream shop, that would be $10 of CAC. And if you make $100 by selling them lots of ice cream, then that would be $100 in LTV. Right? And that would mean that for every dollar you spent, you brought in $10, which would be great. So if you have a business like that, please let me know. So this is sin number 1 is like when we're first starting a business and we're incubating an idea, it's important to kind of put it down on a piece of paper, but it doesn't need to be super dialed in. When you start actually expending money to get customers, like when you're in that validation period, you need to at least have kind of a finger in the wind to say like, okay, I'm spending $1 and I'm getting $1. Not great, not bad. If you're spending $1 and you're not getting anything back, well, ask some more questions. If you're spending $5 and getting $1 back, well then you're probably going to run out of money pretty fast. So it's just the basic profitability of a business. And so oftentimes what we find with early stage companies is that their economics are upside down, meaning that they're spending $2 and they're making $1 and they don't even know. So we talked a little bit about this, of how to actually come up with these costs. So a CAC is basically the fully burdened cost of sales, marketing, technology, media costs, and overhead. Anything that is specifically related to getting a customer. And LTV is basically the gross margin of customers over time. And for investors that are looking to invest in early stage companies, there's kind of this magic ratio. And it's typically a 5x ratio. So it means that if I give you $1 to invest in your business, I want that to bring me back $5. If I give you $1 and you give me 50 cents back, not a great investment for me. So there's this kind of magic ratio that investors are looking for, which is typically 1 to 5 or a 5x CAC ratio. What that means is that your business is very efficient in turning $1 into $5, and you're not going to have to raise that much money in order to be able to scale because your business makes a profit, right? Good business. When you spend $2 and make $1, bad business. So what I want to do is talk about, this is a basic framework that, do you have a, yes?
So LTV is lifetime value, right? So it might be very long period, like whole lifetime. So it might be many years. How you can really calculate it?
I'm very conservative with these things. So I usually use 24 months. So, and that, yeah, that's a real simple measure around it. You use an estimate and you continue to try to get clearer and clearer about it. the point is that you're thinking about it, right? If you're not thinking about this at all, and you're running a business, it's kind of like driving with your eyes closed. So this is, I think, a helpful model when you think about how to design an actual business model. Is that when you think about, let's say this is the value or LTV of a customer. So let's use $1, $10, $100, $1,000, $10,000, $100,000, and $1 million. This is different value of a customer. What this is essentially the complexity, how hard it is to get a customer to buy something, right? So on the far left-hand side would be freemium, right? So let's use an example of, everyone knows Spotify, right? So Spotify is a freemium model, right? Because they don't make $1 million from a customer, right? They make like $10 a month. So in order for them to make money, they have to have a very, very, very low cost of acquiring customer. Does everyone follow me? Just nod your head so I make sure I'm moving in the right direction. All right, cool. Oftentimes what you find where business models kind of get upside down is when you have something that's really complicated to sell, right? Takes 2 weeks or a month or 6 months to try to sell somebody something, and they only give you $1,000. Everyone understand why that would be a bad business? Yeah, okay, cool. So typically what you're trying to do is kind of find this middle ground where freemium can work. That can actually work great. It can be a great business, right? But you have to be able to monetize them at if it there's nothing that's actually free to acquire a customer. They just might cost you, let's say $10 to acquire a customer, and then you would want to be making $50 from them as a lifetime. The same goes for enterprise sales. If a customer is worth $100,000 to you, and you can afford to spend $20,000 to acquire them. Real simple math, but that's kind of the magic ratio there. Yeah, so there's not a right or a wrong in terms of a business model. Think about these as types of sales, right? Types of a business model. So you have freemium, you have no touch, which is kind of like self-sign up sort of thing. You have inside sales, which is like done over the phone. A salesperson can do 10 a day, right? So you can make the numbers work there. You have like channel and field sales. Like field sales, you have to send somebody out there like in a car with a briefcase and like go to someone's office and sit down in a meeting with them. So that better be worth a lot. Channel is oftentimes if you're selling through a partner, like a distributor or something like that. So what I've found is that it's not necessarily, I'm not telling people that, hey, you should stick here. What I'm saying is that you need to think about this process, because oftentimes what I find with early stage companies is that they have pie in the sky ideas and they have to go out and like meet somebody at their office to sell something that's $1,000, and then there's just the business never going to make money. Does that make sense? Lots of businesses. Oracle, right? Oracle is one of the biggest companies in the world, and they have a field sales organization, but also a customer is worth $2 million to them, $5 million, $10 million for them. Make sense? Cool. So here's kind of the main takeaways that I have with regard to the first sin, which is the economics being upside down. First thing is if you are kind of early in the days, especially if you're in B2B, start charging early. In a business to business setting, like that's one of the validation points, is are businesses willing to spend money to solve the problem that you think they have? And then the second thing is that with CAC and LTV, imagine that there's a dollar that you spend and there's $5 that comes back. Imagine that that's a constant balancing act, and you can be optimizing to spend less than $1, and you can also be optimizing to make more than $5 back. And over time, the business, you're basically constantly trying to drive your cost of acquiring a customer down and trying to drive the revenue of each customer up. And the third thing is, as entrepreneurs, like we're all optimistic, otherwise we would never do this stupid thing called entrepreneurship. But in some cases, it can be your enemy. And what I mean by that is completely unrealistic sense of what it either costs to get a customer or what you think they're going to give you back in return. So optimism in terms of building a business is great, but it's important to be pessimistic with these numbers, because if you can have them work pessimistically, then in reality it will probably come back somewhere in the middle. The second thing, boiling the ocean. So this is something I see that's really common, which is, and it's a transition point between early incubation, where all customers are good customers, to when you move into the validation and the upshift phase, that actually changes. And in order to grow faster, you need to actually do less. Focus on less customers, less types of customers, less geographies, and oftentimes concentration is what helps you go faster. So I always say, like, in the beginning, when you're a startup, like, shoot with a shotgun and then start shooting with a sniper rifle. And this is a process that I've developed for all the companies that I work with on how to do that. Good. I was an aspiring comedian back in college, so if people don't laugh at my jokes, I'll be really hurt. So this is just a 4-step process that I've built in how to kind of master that transition from shooting with a shotgun to shooting with a sniper rifle. Step 1 is typically a win-loss analysis. So with any company that I invest in or advise, I'll always go in and say, like, I want to know all the attributes of all your best customers, and I want to know all the attributes of all your worst customers. Right down to how many Facebook likes they have, how long they've had social media profiles. Like, I want to know everything about them. And what makes some people great customers and what other ones terrible customers. So that's a kind of a win-loss analysis. And then what gets shaped out of that is what I call an ideal customer profile, is the attributes of all your best customers, right? So let's say you have 100 customers and you have 10 of them that are spending 5 times as much as everyone else. Well, rather than go and try to get 100 more customers, what I want is actually 20 more that share the exact same attributes of those 5. So that's the ideal customer profile. And once you have a much better sense of your ideal customer profile, you can actually build messaging that appeals to those customers rather than is very generic. You can say, hey, here, I'm speaking to customers like you, and you have these kinds of problems because I got 5 other customers that look exactly like you. And so what happens here is that because you're starting to be more focused and more targeted, you have more targeted messaging, and then you're executing and going after those smaller subset of customers, the engine starts, or the kind of the flywheel starts to turn faster and faster and faster and faster. And when you're in a startup, typically this process is done once a month. And then it starts to go reel back to once every 2 months and once a quarter. But this is kind of a constant tuning of the engine, which helps it to move much faster rather than getting clogged up with a bunch of bad customers. So that's the process that I've used there. Kind of the big takeaways here is focus on less segments and less verticals. Optimize those segments or verticals and then go out and replicate them. Oftentimes when you're running a company, you are basically competing against running out of money and running out of time. And so if you spread that money and time over too many verticals or too many different customer segments, you kind of run the risk of being kind of stuck in neutral or quicksand. You can't make forward progress. And the third thing is, and this is applicable for people that are just starting companies as well, is I always ask the question, like, so who's your customer? Like, tell me exactly who the customer is and why are they interested in this? And oftentimes people say, well, all software companies could be my customer. And I say, well, yeah, maybe. But focus on these 3 things, which is who are the customers that have the most urgent, pervasive, and costly need? Like, who are those people? Let's go talk to those people, because it means that all of them have the same problem. They all have an urgent problem, and they all have a costly problem. If it's pervasive and urgent but not costly, you got a problem, right? Or if it's pervasive, if it's urgent and costly but not pervasive, then you probably have a consulting business. So that's 3 criteria that I use when I kind of think about how to do that. Next thing is, and this one was a mistake that I made 4 times, probably for 4 different reasons, which is hiring a VP of sales too early, especially for like engineering and product focused founders. There's oftentimes this desire to just like huddle away in your dark room and focus on building product, and then try to give this like revenue responsibility to someone else to go out there and do the sales for the business, or to kind of push that responsibility onto someone else. And the reality is, if you're a founder, this is your company. And this is the most important part of your business. If you don't have customers, you don't have a business. And you need to understand, how do you actually get customers, and how do you get them in a repeatable way? And so what I found is that there's typically one of the mistakes that I've seen is very, very common, is hiring a VP of sales too early and thinking that they're just going to go out there and magically make money fall from the sky for you. And unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. You have to actually figure it out yourself. But there is kind of a methodology and a way to go about it. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk to you about. So in the beginning, don't get so focused on the details of this. Just stick with me in spirit of it. Is that this is a buying process. This is one of the first steps when I advise a company. Is I want them to first describe who their customers are, and then I want them to describe exactly how those customers make decisions. And I want them to diagram that, because then they can tell me who their customers are, and they can tell me how they make decisions. That's basically the blueprint for how you go about selling to those customers. The second thing is basically designing the process by which you're going to help them buy. And so once you understand how people buy, then you can build a process for how to sell to them. And this is something that people typically skip over. They just start blasting out a bunch of emails and, like, again, waiting for people to send in their credit card numbers. And it just doesn't work that way. You have to kind of take a more methodical approach to basically design how you're going to help those customers buy. And this is something I've found that oftentimes VPs of sales are kind of like racehorses. Like, they just want to run. And so when they get hired into companies, especially too early, what they do is they hire salespeople, right? And they go out and they sign deals. But it is oftentimes at the detriment of a company. And I've seen a lot of companies go out of business as a result, because they tried to scale too quickly without kind of a blueprint. So it's kind of like the analogy would be, if you're building a house without a set of blueprints, like, the chances are the doors might be on the wrong side of the walls, or the windows might be upside down. And so if you take your time to really kind of build out the blueprints, it pays off in dividends. It actually helps you. It's counterintuitive. It actually helps you move faster when it does come time to scale. So when I think about this, is if you as the founder or the founding team haven't clearly identified all the attributes of your customers, and you haven't identified how they buy and what the blockage points are in the process, that's what you need to spend your time on, not hiring a VP of sales or a salesperson, because they're not going to figure it out for you. In fact, they're just going to make everything worse. Which dovetails into my next point. So it's been estimated that 70% of startup failure is actually a result of premature scaling. And what that means is that typically when you raise money, especially when you raise venture capital, you're given a period of about 12 to 18 months of runway at your current burn. What that means is that you have a finite number of cycles, meaning when you mess something up, you have only a few of those mess ups before you go out of business. So the stakes start to get raised. And what I found is basically once you step on the gas, meaning once you increase your burn and once you add more people to the team, you lose flexibility and agility. And your burn that might have taken you 18 months now goes down and you've got 9 months, which means that if you have a ramp up time of new people on your team of 3 months, and then they're operating for 3 months, it means that if you made the wrong decision there, like, you only have 3 months of cash to be able to move around. And so when I think about when it's time to scale, it's typically when people are like pulling stuff off of your shelves. Like when customers are coming to you just begging for more and more and more, and they're pulling things off your shelves. If that's not happening yet, take more time to get to know your customers and take more time to really understand how they buy and what the problems are that you're solving. Because with a very small team, you can make a lot of pivots and a lot of iterations. Once you add more people to the team, you lose that flexibility and agility. So I think about, oftentimes people say like, okay, well, how do you measure that? How do you know when you're like ready to scale? There's probably a lot of different ways to look at that. There's a few that I'll just talk about as kind of basic benchmarks. One is that like you've been able to kind of replicate the same success. This is one benchmark. Basically, you've been able to replicate success. It's not just one person doing it anecdotally. The second thing is that if you hired a new salesperson, they should be able to produce in 1.5 sales cycles. Now, what does that mean? It means that if it normally takes you a month to sell a customer, then that new sales rep should be able to be a producing member of your team in 6 weeks, right? If it's 3 months later and they're not producing and they're saying, oh, all the checks in the mail with all these people, you got to make some hard decisions. So it's a very simple benchmark to say whether you've hired the right people and whether you have a product that is appealing in the market. And the third is maintaining consistent CAC, LTV, and customer churn. The last one, which isn't on here, is NPS score. So how many people know what NPS is? Oh, this is the nugget that I'm going to drop on you guys today. So Net Promoter Score, if you are planning to do a startup or if you are doing a startup, write this down or commit it to memory. Net Promoter Score is essentially the measurement by which customers would refer you. It's a very simple metric, but it's super powerful. So the question is, on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely would you be to refer this to another company? And what ends up happening is you end up with an average score. And if that average score is less than 7, you end up with more detractors than promoters. What that means is that people are not promoting your business. They're not actually happy with the business and not happy with the service. And so Net Promoter Score is kind of a measuring stick to say whether you have great customer happiness and great customer satisfaction. Typically, companies that have very high Net Promoter Scores in the 8s and 9s oftentimes are starting to get ready to scale because it means that people are just pulling stuff off their shelves. Like they can't make the product or software fast enough. So those are some simple kind of metrics to be using. I can't underscore the importance of Net Promoter Score enough. Sorry? You're asking about. So CAC is cost of acquiring a customer. LTV is the value of a customer. Churn is basically the percentage that are leaving at any given time. The reason I'm not going to dive into churn is that it's really different for each business. Lower is better. That's probably the simplest way to say it.
So I just want to follow up on that NPS score. Like, what's the good way of getting like reliable data for that? I've done quite a lot of user interviews in the past, and you find out that reality is quite different where you're speaking to people.
Yeah. So typically, if you ask them in person, like that, asking people in person is great for customer development, right? Really good for those kind of interviews, like that kind of more qualitative feedback. Typically, NPS scores are done either in a survey or in an app. And so it's done more to get more quantitative data. Yeah? Cool. So this is, I was my first salesperson in my last company. It was actually great because I learned how to do all the different jobs. And then there becomes a point at which I couldn't do all the jobs effectively. And so it's a really common thing that happens is basically as a company starts to get more than 10 customers, or as you as CEO can't handle all the responsibilities of getting customers, think of it like a kind of an auto line. Like when there's one person that just puts on the tires in the car. All they do is put on tires all day long, right? They get really good at putting on tires. They can put them on faster than anyone else. Then there's someone else that puts on the steering wheels, right? There's a reason that one person isn't building the whole car is because it's just inefficient. So what will happen for a company is typically the roles start to get separated, right? When you're in an early founding team, everyone does everything, but that starts to kind of build into slices as you go forward. And it actually creates a lot more efficiency because what can happen is you can take, let's say, a job of finding leads or reaching out to leads, and you can push that or delegate it to someone that's very low cost. And then you can focus on higher value things such as customer meetings or customer development or product. And so there's this transition that typically happens when people are in the validation period and they've got their first customers, and then they're starting to expand. And it's a way that companies can expand really efficiently without hiring a bunch more headcount, as they basically can delegate lower level work, especially in the sales function, to lower level staff. So kind of 3 simple ways to do it. Segmenting the job roles, just again, using the analogy of kind of the mechanized process along an assembly line. Think about the process of getting a customer in the same way. The next thing is delegate or outsource low leverage tasks, meaning things that that I used to use a measure. I would always be calculating my hourly rate, even as CEO of the company. So let's just say when I first started, I was probably making a penny an hour, something along those lines. So my time wasn't super valuable. But as the company grew, I was, at one point I was making $12 an hour. That was pretty exciting. And then I started making $20 an hour and so on from there. And so the way I looked at it is said, okay, when I'm making $20 an hour, anything that I can hire somebody for less than $20 an hour is something that I should get off my plate. Because if I'm doing that, then that means that somebody else can't be doing the work that I'm doing, which is actually way more valuable. So again, when you're making a penny an hour in the first days of a startup, not that important, but it does become important, especially if you're trying to grow the company really fast. Hop on to the next one. So relying on emotion over data. Oh, sure. Yeah, so this is typically something with most people. How many people have salespeople here so far? Okay, so a pretty small percentage of the room have salespeople, but typically when you have a sales organization, what you want to do is start building a kind of a assembly line process. And in the beginning, like the founders typically doing lead generation and meetings and closing and client success and customer happiness. And what you want to do is start pulling those jobs apart as time goes on so that people can become like deep specialists in a certain area. So as an example, like when my company got up to, we had about 60 sales reps, we had people separated to inbound, outbound, geographies, verticals. Like basically you start to pull all of these things apart so that people can be like super specialists in one area. So that's what I was talking about there. I think that the short answer, as with most things, and you're probably not going to want to hear this, is it depends. and what it depends on is, of course, the value of a customer, right? If you have a very low LTV customer, it's more transactional, right? Like they're just calling in. Imagine you're calling into Verizon. You don't have a dedicated customer rep. If you're spending $100,000 a year with someone, yeah, you better believe you're going to have somebody that takes you out for steaks. So the answer is it depends. What I'm saying is, I want to clarify this. I'm saying it from sales people. And the reason oftentimes for that is salespeople oftentimes make really terrible client success people. That's just not in their DNA. Like all they want to do is go hunting. They don't want to they don't want to do the farming part. Yeah, typically. So let's use the assembly line example, right? So as a company, in the beginning, everyone does everything, right? And that's okay. That's totally fine. Once you get past building your first car, you're gonna like, okay, how do we make 5 cars and how do we make them more efficient? Well, the first role would be like the person that just brings the parts to the factory, and that would be in sales. That's oftentimes like a sales development representative, like a very low level kind of entry level job that's just like gathering leads of potential companies, right? And then you have the person that's like putting on the body frame, and that's maybe the salesperson that's like doing the meetings, closing the deal, that sort of thing. And then you start to have the person that's putting on all the finishing touches, which is oftentimes like client success, that level of thing. So the point is that as a company evolves, typically it evolves to have more specialization, and the result of that is increased profitability and increased efficiency. So relying on emotion over data. Something that that we started pretty early on in the company's life cycle, even when it was like literally two of us in like a spare bedroom, was that we did a daily stand-up. Especially when you're building or attempting to build like a venture-funded startup, your success is measured in like daily and weekly growth rate, not monthly, quarterly, or yearly. So it means that you have to be growing at such a rapid rate that you need to be making adjustments and tuning on a daily basis. And so it's something that we started. It was about 15 minutes a day. It was not a big dialogue back and forth. What it was a reporting on the numbers. And we reported on the numbers every single day. And what that did is it was so painful to have to do that. And everyone had to report on what they were doing for the day and what their numbers were, that there was a ton of accountability and transparency. And also we could course correct, like on an hourly basis versus course correcting after something had already happened at the end of the week or at the end of the month. And it was also an opportunity for us to drill people, either on the executive team or as the company grew, because there was so much transparency and you could see the numbers on a graph every single day. There was no place to hide. So for people that were underperforming, it was very clear that they were underperforming, and there was a historical element of underperforming, and those people typically just left because they didn't like to be like in the spotlight every single day of having their numbers on the wall and having everyone see them and having to report on them. Again, that is when you're trying to build like a super high growth, venture funded technology company. There is that pressure to grow, and that's one of the ways that I was able to do that. The last thing is flying blind. This is surprising. Even at very large companies, they don't actually know their numbers very well. And so oftentimes this is something that I want instituted immediately with any of the companies that I work with, is how do they know the metrics? So a good analogy would be if you're driving a race car and you don't have a dashboard, you don't know when to turn right or turn left, or to push on the gas or to push on the brakes. And starting a venture-funded startup is kind of like taking a scooter and strapping a rocket to the back of it. And so you need to be able to know when to turn right, when to turn left, or when to pump the brakes or pump the gas. And oftentimes, people really aren't paying attention to the numbers. So this was an example for me. Again, it's more illustrative, more than anything else, just so you kind of get the concept and let it digest for you. Is we had week, month, and quarter. And for all the different metrics, they were by individual, by source, and over time. And that way you could see the trends, right? We could see if we were running out of gas, or we could see if the oil was running low, or we could see if the windshield washer fluid was running low as we're driving the car. And most often people are kind of running their businesses by a hunch. And that's fine in the early days when you're just shaping something out of clay. But then it becomes kind of a detriment of a company as you're starting to accelerate. If you can't steer and you don't know how to steer, you don't have the visibility to steer, oftentimes you kind of run the car off the road. So again, just kind of another example. She can send this around. You can kind of see, I guess, how I thought about this stuff as we were growing. This might be, if you don't have a bunch of salespeople, this might be a little bit too much in the weeds. So I'm going to skip this one. Because essentially what you're trying to do is you're trying to see how the business is progressing over time in different time segments and also by stage. So that way you can spot the problems. Oftentimes it takes people too long to spot the problems when something's gone wrong. And so that's really the principle behind doing the daily stand-ups is you're able to catch problems a lot faster and get out ahead of them rather than looking at the end of the month and saying, oh, what happened? Why didn't we grow this month? So I guess for now, I just want to ask, I'll hang around and answer some questions for you. And if nobody asks any questions, then I'll just assume you guys have figured all this stuff out. And maybe I should come and work for you.
Yeah, so the question is regarding the change in culture, and purchase culture, because I see that lots of the companies are changing the titles of their salespeople to Google is going through strategies, and they seem to be moving in what I'm observing, at least in the B2B space, towards customer success, account engineers and stuff like this, so that more and more people are hesitant to talk to poor play salespeople because they feel like they are not responsible for delivering the value. And I see companies responding to that by changing the roles and then shifting around the responsibilities, moving a little bit of the sales responsibilities to the customer success side or the account engineers and stuff like this. Do you see this affecting the way that these high growth companies are doing sales?
So I guess it would depend on what the people are buying. So oftentimes what I've seen is a shift of when we looked at that graph, it said LTV and sales complexity, and we talked about freemium, and we talked about all those different segments. Oftentimes what I've seen is the things on the left-hand side, so things where a customer can almost self-serve. So I'm seeing more and more customers being able to be sophisticated enough to self-serve, and then they're being assisted by somebody in customer success. Because people are being able to now, you didn't used to be able to buy software by looking online, right? It's a new thing in the last 5 years. And so customers are now being able to serve themselves more. And so that's part of what's driving that transition. But if you still look at any of these large companies, they might change the name on their email footer, but for most of these companies, 40% of their organizations are salespeople, which is not something nobody talks about that. Because it's not the sexy, cool Silicon Valley stuff, but it's it's how the world turns.
Thanks for the really interesting lecture. So I actually have 2 questions. So first, how would you, what's your view on some incentive system for the salespeople? How you compensate them? Do you make a bonus structure depending on gross profits or revenues? And how do you deal then with impact on the, not that culture, but to make not too high compensation if they're really growing fast compared to tech sector? And other thing is related to your scene 1 and 2, because if I look at the startups, I see many actually of them that don't have unit economics cost. For example, I think even Uber makes huge losses, and even regarding scene 2, they are not quite concentrated because they do B2B, they do customers, they acquire them on internet all over the place. So can you analyze some companies?
Sure. So answer to the first question is around compensation structures. Is that right? Yep. So I guess the first thing to understand is it will probably change 20 times. If you hire salespeople, it's just going to change. As the company grows, what you think is important to compensate right now is not going to be important in 6 months, or it's going to change. So just as founders, just know that. It's okay. Don't try to get this perfect, spend 6 months trying to get this perfect structure, because most likely in the next 3 months, it's going to change. So that being said, a good rule of thumb is that typically salespeople want an opportunity to make at least 50% more based on commission. So let's use an example. Let's say that they're making $50,000 as a base. They want an opportunity to make 75 to 100 based on performance. Right? So that's just a good rule of thumb. In the early days of a startup, there's actually a very particular life cycle that companies go through in who they should hire as a salesperson. And there's a great article called The Sales Learning Curve. It's a Harvard Business Review article. And it basically talks about let's use an example. Let's say you're an early stage technology company, right? One of the worst salespeople that you could hire is somebody from Salesforce. Why? Any idea? But why? Like, why would that be a bad hire?
Because they are used to the systems, to the structure of big companies. I'm from SAP.
Yeah.
I used to be sales in SAP.
Yeah.
So it's very hard to work in a startup as a sales
Exactly, right?
because you do everything yourself.
Yep.
Yeah.
And you're used to, when you call someone, everyone's like, oh yeah, SAP, yeah.
Yeah.
They'll at least give you 30 seconds.
Yes.
And when you're in a startup, nobody gives a shit about your company.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that would be the answer to the first one. The second one is I actually don't necessarily agree with your assessment there, so I want to clarify it a little bit. I think what you were asking was around the unit economics, and the second thing was around focus versus going wide. So when you look at the unit economics of Uber as an example, if you look at it on like a dollar in, dollar out perspective, they actually would have great unit economics. That's different than a yearly P&L statement, which would say, did they lose money or make money in a year? So typically when companies are growing at the rate of an Uber or any kind of venture scale technology company, what they want to be able to show is that if I wasn't trying to grow so aggressively, I could be making a profit on every single customer that I brought in. Does that make sense? That's very important, right? Otherwise, people wouldn't invest in a company like that. The second part is that if you look at all these businesses, they always find a wedge. Like if you look at Amazon, like Amazon sells everything, right? But in the beginning, all they sold was books. And when Uber started, all they did was black cars in San Francisco. So I don't agree with that assessment. I don't think in my experience, it's not accurate. Typically, people start with a very specific problem that they can actually handle, because most often it's like 2 people in a garage or 4 people in a garage, right? Like you're not going to like take down the taxi industry with 3 people. So they typically start with something very small, create a wedge, and then they can expand into other things.
That's an interesting point that you mentioned. So do you think that might change if all this money that's floating around will eventually go away when the bubble pops at some point in the next few years? Do you think companies will have to change their ways and become more conservative when all this money that's just floating around goes away?
So that's assuming that it goes away. But let's just play that out. So I think that's already happening in Silicon Valley. Companies are pulling back to make sure that they get right side up unit economics. So they're pulling back especially with the IPO market being a little bit cold. Companies were pulling back to get to profitability and sacrificing a little bit of growth to get better unit economics. So it's already happening, and it's typically happening in the board meetings, kind of behind closed doors, to say, hey, now's the right time to step on the gas, or right now is the right time to pump the brakes a little bit.
Yeah, Gabriel, thanks for the talk. And could you tell a little bit more about this scheme you just showed us about building scheme or plan of user customer decision, and based on this, different probably stages of this decision, building sales. Could you maybe share us more of this?
You're talking about the customer journey? So is that what you're asking about? Like
Maybe
the kind of the diagram of the customer journey?
Maybe not if I understood, not only journey but customer acquisition journey. How you, I mean, you mentioned that there is a way how customer make decision. So there is some process, and based on this process, you build different sales. Could you tell more about this? It's not clear.
Yeah, sure. So like the classic model of a customer journey, that's like the most simplified version would be like awareness, consideration, purchase, repurchase, right? Like that's like a 4-step process. And you could probably just start there. So first off, a customer needs to be aware that they have a problem, and they're aware of solutions. So that could start with an online search, right? If for something that's out there, maybe they have a problem with their HR software, or they have a problem with X or Y, right? So they're aware of the problem. They're starting to look for solutions. And then there's consideration, which is, okay, I'm looking at these 3 different softwares, or I'm looking at these 3 different things, trying to decide which one's best for me. Then they make a purchase. And then there's kind of that decision, which is, did I make the right purchase? And am I going to keep repurchasing, or am I going to churn out and try one of the other tools? That's the probably most simple rudimentary way to think about it. And then the thing that you layer over the top of that is if you put, the important part is that you put yourself in your customer's shoes to understand if they're in the awareness phase or if they're in the consideration phase, what are they considering? Are they considering cost? Are they considering like the ramp up time? Are they considering technology involved? Like, what are the things that they're considering? And your job in sales or in business development is to kind of bring the answers to those things before knowing that they're thinking about those things and that they're in the consideration phase. That's a great opportunity to be talking about how it's been so easy for other people to go on with you, or how the cost is typically 1/10 of everyone else, or whatever it may be. So it's kind of like being able to avoid all of the objections before they ever happen. And oftentimes people don't put themselves into their customers' shoes, and they try to basically push stuff on their customers. And with this day and age, like, customers will just stop returning your calls.
So by structure, you mean that to build actually from the sales perspective all the steps, and also, you know, assuming and resolve all the questions, it's a sales system instead of just go and sell, right? It's what you're saying.
The point is, like, your job is to help customers buy, not to push stuff on them. That's like selling cars in the 1980s, right? Like, that era is done.
Doesn't work anymore, right?
Yeah, it doesn't work anymore. So now you need to educate people and help them buy. And in order to do that, you need to understand their process of how they're going to become aware of the problem, how they're going to consider different solutions, how they're going to make their purchase, what their criteria is for sticking with you.
Hi, thanks. I have a question concerning the validation phase. You were talking about the fact that the CEO probably in the beginning has to do like 10 sales or the most sales. Does that mean that the CEO will always be the best salesperson?
I would say that typically the CEO should always know the most about the customer. That would be the simplest way to say it. They may not have the best like techniques, but what they should know better than anyone else is the customer's needs and the customer's desires and the customer's pain points, because that's what your business is built around, is the customer. And so that you may not be like a classically trained salesperson. That's not the important part. You can hire people to like run the process, but if you don't understand the customer's pain points and their problems, then you for sure can't hire a salesperson, because how are they going to know that stuff if you don't know it?
So you said like if you want to grow, you should like define processes and like stick to processes you define. And did you collect experiences with agile mindsets and like growing with agile stuff? So that means like more self-responsible, small teams, and then grow with that?
Can you clarify the question a little bit? So when I was talking about like structure and process, it's around making these transitions from stage to stage. Like, structure and process, not helpful for a company that's in the incubation period. You're just shaping an idea out of clay, right? It's more free form. When you start to move from validation and start to go from, like, your first 10 customers is going to be ugly. You're going to scratch and claw to like don't use the number 10 like as gospel, but your first customers are probably going to they're not going to have everything in common. They're going to be from all different places, different price points, like all that stuff is fine. It's when you're trying to build a repeatable system to go from 10 to 100, that's when those processes become more helpful. But as you could see, even the process of kind of that engine of like the 4 steps is very similar to lean startup methodology, right? You're coming up with assumptions around who your customers are, the ideal customer profile, the messaging. You're testing and measuring and executing, and then evaluating using that win-loss analysis, so that the I guess the flow through process is very similar. I think that's what you were asking about.
So it's like, is this like because the bigger companies have disadvantages because they are not so agile in reacting on something, but they're really good in process. So like really good in doing certain stuff, like building a car. So the question is how you can combine this, you know, like have kind of loose processes, but like do it in agile teams, for example?
So I mean, in the beginning, when you're an early stage company, there's only whatever 2 people or 4 people or something like that. It kind of takes care of itself. It's kind of a non-issue. The question is, when do you start putting that stuff in? And typically that's when like the reference point would be when you have product market fit, like when you have high NPS, people are pulling stuff off the shelves, you have customers that are coming to you trying to buy the product, and you have good unit economics. Then you need to build a system to be able to make that repeatable, right? So the structure and process become more valuable when you're trying to make something predictable or repeatable. Oftentimes, as a measure of thumb, that's like seed series A, depending on where you're at. Because without any structure or process at that point, you start to lose measurement, and also you start to lose consistency. So imagine if we use the building a car analogy, it's like build your first car, like one person can build all 5 cars. That's totally fine. When you want to build 100 cars, like you start to need people to do different jobs, and you start to need a little bit more structure and process. When you want to build 1,000 cars, you need more and more and more, and it just kind of builds on top of itself.
You said that you scaled too quickly 5 times. I'm just a bit curious, like what you identified. You thought you had product market fit, and then 5 times. Just, really curious about it.
Yeah. So there's probably 2 that stand out more than the other ones, but I'll explain them. So the first time was just like bravado. So ego and bravado, like nothing more than that. Like I was just like, I want to grow faster. And I went like from, I think, me being the first salesperson, I was like, I'm going to hire 5. So 1 to 5, back down to 1. And then we went up to 5, up to 12, and then back down to 5. And that was because I hired a VP of sales too early. And I should have just done it myself. Like I should have just managed it myself. And then we went, let's see, back up to 12, then to 24, and then back down to, I think, 8, some give or take a couple. And that one was, again, hiring the wrong VP of sales. It was somebody that came from a big company, lots of structure, lots of process, but it was overly complex for that stage. And then probably the most painful one is when we went up to, I think, 65 salespeople in the period of maybe 2.5 months, like a very, very fast ramp. We were hiring like 10 people a day, something like that. And the mistake we made there was that we actually had great unit economics. So we had great CAC, and we had good LTV numbers. We hired all these people, trained them all up, and we're closing 10 times as many deals as we had ever closed before. Every single day it was like bang, 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 just deals. And it felt great. And then I guess as 4 months went past, and we started to see churn. And churn had 3x'd. We lost control over all the messaging for customers, and they were way over promising what we could deliver. And so the end result of that was that our LTV was cut in half. It was super painful, right? So we had 90 days worth of cash in the bank, and we had to cut it down to 8 people, and then build it all back up again. So that's unfortunately, I always just say, being an entrepreneur is basically either being punched or looking around waiting to be punched and not knowing where it's going to come from. And that's why it's don't start a startup because you think you're going to make a lot of money. Start a startup because you either have a problem that you cannot stop thinking about, or if you're unemployable like me.
How do you get back trust? Because if you have troubles like that and need to restart again, how did you get back the trust of your customers? Because if you have a salesperson there which promises too much, it hurts a company. If the salesperson can't sell it really good, it hurts also your company. So how did you solve that?
Lots of mea culpas. Lots of mea culpas, which is I'm sorry. Unfortunately, there was no simple math through that. It was just we're sorry, and you can totally leave and we'll give you your money back if that is the case. And we're really sorry. Or we can try to make it right. And at the end of the day, like, that's all you can really do. So we were fortunate to be able to recover from that, but we probably lost, I don't know, 30, 40% of our customer base in a very short period of time. And we built it back up. And it's, whatever, 15 years ago I started that company.
Thank you.
Que la famille.